Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Rhodesia survived. Rhodesia is nowadays Zimbabwe. The name changed for various reasons. One of the reasons is that once the blacks started to get the majority in Rhodesia, they wanted to rename it, of course. Rhodesia derives from Cecil Rhodes, who is nowadays considered a very controversial figure. Rhodes was a mining magnate and a politician in southern Africa, who served as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He went on and founded Rhodesia, which included northern Rhodesia, nowadays called Zambia, and also southern Rhodesia, which eventually became Rhodesia and nowadays is Zimbabwe. Rhodesia had many whites, especially many Brits and other Europeans who immigrated to Rhodesia to establish a permanent home in there. Moreover, the immigration was very restrictive and only people with money could go there. Rhodesia was also not really seen as indigenous African territory, but more of a multiracial state, akin to South Africa. Rhodesia started to develop and had a rapid economic and industrial expansion going on. Many mines had been founded and also many high-skilled people, they started to move to Rhodesia and started to work. They contributed to a diversified economy. So not only agriculture became important, but also many other things. The problem Rhodesia had was that Britain adopted a policy of no independence before majority rule. Many whites in Rhodesia were against this, but everyone knew that this had to happen eventually. Portugal gave Ian Smith a maximum support after Britain refused to support Portugal when India annexed Goa. And Rhodesia thus declared an unilateral independence. Rhodesia was turned into a Portuguese and South African client state, although not officially, but in fact it was dependent on both states. But even South Africa after a time withdrew its support, and Portugal had to relinquish its control in Africa. And finally, with the Bush Wars happening, well, that was pretty much the end for Rhodesia. But what if all of that changed? What if Rhodesia survived? One point of divergence I could propose is that either the visit of Ian Smith to Portugal, where he will see Salazar, which never had happened, or that the British would be able to compromise with Rhodesia, and they would then become more flexible with their policy of no independence before majority, stating the multiracial character of Rhodesia and projecting an increase of the white population. This would give Rhodesia a chance to develop more and more economically and to be not internationally isolated. Even without a visit to Lisbon, the Portuguese would prefer Rhodesia than even a black majority ruled country such as Zimbabwe. And the Brits may have made an interesting deal where they could have secured certain parts of the mines, or where they would ask for some shares of Rhodesia's wealth. And they could then pull off something similar as the French did in our timeline, with the franc of the financial community of Africa, for instance. Instead, Ian Smith would try to play the long game and try to somehow negotiate also with the Brits, or tell them that the majority of the population would be able to vote eventually, but that he had to somehow make reforms, or that it would not be able to happen instantaneously. This will have many consequences, because first of all, it will make a Bush war almost impossible. Some more radical powers will try to get their points established, and we might also see politicians like Mugabe trying to take control, but they would be outpowered by the higher numbers of whites as compared in OGL, and also by a moderate mixed and black population who at first they would then try to trust into the promises that were made by the government. With the advancements in the economic development, many poorer people could potentially also be lifted up and out of poverty. Additionally, without the Bush War, a higher economic activity is ensured, and thus more people, including the blacks, they will then also have a work or even benefit from it. The problem that Rhodesia will face is that it could get some pressure of Portugal and South Africa. As for Portugal, Rhodesia could then try to mediate peace talks between the native African liberation movements and the Portuguese government, but I don't really think that much of it would come out because, well, the Rhodesians, they were still very much controlled by the whites, and also the blacks that would then start to be lifted up into minister positions or that would have voting rights, they would be seen as maybe traitors by the people of Mozambique or of Angola. Then South Africa, they could criticize Rhodesia for keeping up their plans by extending voting rights to the majority of the population because, well, with South Africa we know that they needed to have a certain point of view where they had their certain system such as apartheid, but then again the South Africans, they couldn't just ruin their reputation and the relationship with Rhodesia because otherwise, well, South Africa would be again internationally isolated. And thus they would then try to somehow get a good relationship with Rhodesia, but it would not be at its best. Even with Rhodesia trying to keep their promise, South Africa would still try to come and convince Rhodesia that they should adapt their system, the apartheid and stuff like this. But Rhodesia will probably not really like this idea, knowing that it will just create more problems in the long run. The newly independent countries around Rhodesia, like Mozambique for instance, they would also not have that much contempt for Rhodesia, but they will also not really see Rhodesia as South Africa for instance. They will see Rhodesia as with a very skeptical view, but they will just, they will observe what is happening in Rhodesia, if it really will become something great or if at the end it will just become something like South Africa. Instead of South Africa, Rhodesia would be deemed as the most pro-Western nation of that part of Africa and enjoy good relations with Britain and the rest of the West. With a continuous prosperity, more immigrants such as whites but also Asians, they could then come to Rhodesia. Many Indians, for instance, who used to live in Uganda, or those remaining in South Africa but not seeing any chances to have some type of prosperity, they would then move to Rhodesia, for instance. And as a result, Rhodesia would become an African melting pot. With the native Africans gaining more rights, we would also have African-born Indians, perhaps even Chinese, and many whites from Britain, African-born whites, or from other parts of the Anglophone world, and not to mention the mixed people that would also live in there. One point of tension would of course be the political participation, but it would eventually be guaranteed to every adult. Then we might see more radical factions, extreme right-wing whites, for instance, who would propose an apartheid state, and extremist black groups who would like to expel every white and who would see all the evil just in the white people and who would then like to also get all their lands. And then we would also get another problem, which would be the more economic problem, which would include mostly black people, but we could also later on see whites suffering from this economic problem. The majority of the land, factory, etc. would be held by a small elite, and after some more years this elite would not only be white, but also some important black people would be included. They could be important chiefs, for instance, of certain tribes, or close associates to the elite, and thus it would not really become anymore a fight between white and blacks, but it would just become a fight of rich versus poor. And if Rhodesia chooses the following path, that of the open borders, of course. Because if such policies are chosen, poor South African whites, they may also start to flock into Rhodesia and many more people around the world as well. However, if Rhodesia continues to have still very restrictive immigration policies, then it might be very well become portrayed as whites against the blacks, and Rhodesia could see stronger extremist factions rising. Once South Africa abandons the apartheid system, some people may take Rhodesia as example, but I don't think that it will change much of South Africa or any other states around Rhodesia. And actually South Africa will still see a decline, and the rise of criminality would drive more people to Rhodesia again. At this point we may very well have a balanced population in Rhodesia, and Australia for instance would get less white South Africans because they would feel more inclined to move to Rhodesia. Rhodesia could also see a few extremist attacks, but this would be the exception, and everyone would pretty much agree that they had to work together to improve their conditions. And yes, even the whites would agree with the blacks that a small elite with an immense richness wouldn't be alright and that this should be questioned. While South Africa continues its decline, Rhodesia could adopt a good social welfare program, but in return the country would start to get problems with illegal immigration, which would then cause problems between the Rhodesians and the newly arrived South Africans. The social welfare program, healthcare, etc. would be accepted by pretty much all the parties except for the more libertarian and liberal parties, while at the same time Rhodesia could see a more unique type of right-wing nationalism that would be promoted as Rhodesianism, and that this Rhodesianism would need to be protected by certain borders, that of Rhodesia of course. Botswana could become a good ally to Rhodesia, and if Namibia gets some investments and inspiration from Rhodesia as well, it too could become a more successful state. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.